We're continuing our sermon series on biblical characters, and we heard the story of Ruth this morning. Well, part of the story of Ruth, and that's who I'm going to be talking about today, Ruth. And that story is something like a fairy tale. It's where the main characters go through this difficult time, through a difficult quest, and then live happily ever after. Or maybe it's more like a folk tale. But the Bible doesn't let us believe that it's a fictional story. The names of real people and real places are used. And in fact, what it is a family story carried down generation to generation. I think that the whole story began being told by Naomi. It wasn't told by Ruth or Boaz. It was Naomi's story. That's what I believe. Instead of beginning with once upon a time, the real historical timing was named. It says, now it came to pass in the days when the judges ruled. Those days are specifically indicated in the Bible. They come not terribly long after the story of Rahab that I talked about 2 weeks ago. Remember, the Israelites were delivered by God from Egypt, and they wandered in the wilderness for 40 years. And then a hero named Joshua took charge after Moses died. And he began with Jericho to conquer the whole nation of Canaan. And that was where Rahab lived. He conquered most of the land, and the Israelites began to settle down. After Joshua, there was no single leader that all the Israelites looked toward. Instead, the Lord raised up judges. They were in some cases tribal leaders who would adjudicate disputes, like the word judge implies, but most of them were military leaders who protected the people. And in fact, in Judges 2, it says, then the Lord raised up judges who saved them out of the hands of these raiders. Yet they would not listen to their judges, but prostituted themselves to other gods and worshipped them. They quickly turned from the ways of their ancestors who had been obedient to the Lord's commands. So the judges sort of helped them stay in line with God's commandments as well. But there was no real peace in the land. Things were unstable. The book of Judges recounts how over and over the Israelites failed, yet God would rescue them. So I'm going to go through a little list of life during the time of the Judges, because that's when this is set. Israel does evil in the eyes of the Lord. The Lord gives or sells them into the hands of oppressors. Israel serves these oppressors for years. They have to pay taxes to them, or they have to be slaves to them. Then Israel cries out to the Lord. The Lord raises up a deliverer, that is, a judge. The oppressor is subdued by this judge. The land has peace, or rest, for X number of years. And then we go back to number one. It's a cycle. Israel does evil in the eyes of the Lord, and this just keeps on recurring. So in those days, as it says, Israel had no king. Everyone did as they saw fit. And this is repeated at least twice in the book of Judges. Everyone did what was right in their own eyes, is how the King James Version has it. So this is the state of things during the story of Ruth. But this story is not about the nation of Israel. It's about a small family with problems, many problems. The first problem is that there's a famine in Israel. Famine is a huge problem, right? The second problem, though, is that Elimelech, his wife Naomi, and their two sons, Mahlon and Chilion, left Bethlehem, yes, that Bethlehem, for Moab. And why is that a problem? Well, if there's nothing to eat where you are, you have to go where there's food. I certainly get that. I probably would have been the first one out of Bethlehem, but it seems likely that Elimelech jumped the gun. 10 years later, when Naomi returns, everyone is still there and doing just fine. In fact, the name Bethlehem literally translates to house of bread. But Elimelech thought he could do better, and he took off for Moab. And Moab, that's the third problem. Moab was infamous for not helping Israel when they needed them. You've heard about how in Jesus' time, all the Israelites hated the Samaritans. Well, Samaritans didn't exist yet in this time. So instead, during the time of Judges, Moab was the despised enemy. In Psalm 108, verse 9, God says, Moab is my wash basin. On Edom I toss my sandal. Over Philistia I shout in triumph. Well, wash basin, you mean where I throw my dirty laundry? That is not a compliment, just saying. Elimelech, Naomi, Mahlon, and Chilion left to live for a while in the country of Moab. That's what it says. I think that may indicate the fourth problem. They weren't planning to stay, but by the time Naomi returned to Bethlehem, 10 years had passed. The sons had married Moabite women. They had put down roots. That wasn't what they intended, and it wasn't necessarily what God wanted. Then, biggest problem for Naomi, Elimelech died, and after him, both sons, Mahlon and Chilion. Naomi was the only one left, and that was the biggest of all the problems. In fact, it was a tragedy for her. Neither of Naomi's daughters-in-law, Ruth or Orpah, had children. Naomi was bereft, without any support. She had nearly lost hope, but she heard that God had come to the aid of his people, and there was food again in Israel. So she and Orpah and Ruth set out for Bethlehem. Naomi was deep in thought during this travel experience. She was clearly troubled, and finally she stopped on the road and told Orpah and Ruth to go back to their homes, to their parents' homes. She prayed to God for them, asking him to show them kindness and grant them new husbands. And frankly, the young widows were shocked. They wept, they protested, but Naomi stood firm. She had no hope for them if they accompanied her. She believed God had turned against her, and it made her bitter. This speech she gives them is full of pain. It's one reason why I think Naomi is the original storyteller here. No one else would have been as hard on themselves as she was, or as hard on her as she was on herself. Orpah obediently kissed Naomi goodbye and went home. But Ruth did not. Ruth loved Naomi. Ruth was not willing to abandon her, even though she had no idea how she could help. It turned out that Ruth had more faith than her mother-in-law did. Now, I am assuming that she converted to Judaism in order to marry Mahlon, and that she had learned something about the God of Israel. She had faith. Remember that Naomi said, "Return to your homes and your gods." Well, Ruth wouldn't do that. She said, "Don't urge me to leave you or to turn back from you. Where you go, I will go. Where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, if even death separates you and me." Well, faced with that beautiful speech, Naomi relented. They continued walking until they finally arrived at Bethlehem. And Bethlehem met Naomi with great excitement. The whole town went a little nuts. Naomi had been gone 10 years. They never expected to see her again. Now, others may have left during the famine, but they had returned. Naomi was among the people they thought had been gone for good. "Can this be Naomi?" all the women asked. In her sad state, Naomi said, "Call me Mara, because the Almighty has made my life very bitter. I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi? The Lord has afflicted me. The Almighty has brought misfortune upon me." Now, Naomi means pleasant, and Mara means bitter. I'm painting kind of a bad picture of Naomi, maybe. It's not flattering, but it's truthful. When people go through tough times, it can bring out the worst in them. Her resentment, that she blamed her God, it was understandable in its way, and we've all done it. And I wonder, how might things have been different for Naomi if she had just stayed in Bethlehem during the famine, like the others had? I wonder if stretching her faith a little further rather than running to Moab would have been the right thing to do. But on the other hand, God had a plan that included Ruth. So coming home to Bethlehem wasn't a joy for Naomi. She remembered how happy she had been. Her life had been full. Now she returned empty. Naomi was hopeless, but Ruth seemed to be energized. The barley harvest was just beginning, and Ruth had an idea. She said to Naomi, "Let me go to the fields and pick the leftover grain left behind anyone in whose eyes I find favor." And Naomi said, "Go ahead, my daughter." The gleaning that she was talking about was part of the law that God had given his people through Moses. When you reap the harvest of your land, do not reap to the very edges of your field or gather the gleanings of your harvest. Do not go over your vineyard a second time or pick up the grapes that have fallen. Leave them for the poor and the foreigner. I am the Lord your God. And this is from Leviticus chapter 19. I think Ruth might have found it a lot easier to love and follow a God like this, who cares about the poor and the foreigners, than many Israelites like Naomi who were born into God's family. The foreign gods of that time cared mostly about war. To get anything from them, you needed to sacrifice, and even then, the gods didn't really care about you. They were only theoretically appeased by the sacrifice. A God who really cared about the poor would be incredibly appealing. So Ruth did it. She went to a field and asked permission to gather behind the harvesters. A few hours after she began to work, the owner of the field arrived, and the workers were happy to see him. They greeted him with pleasure. He noticed Ruth and asked about her. He came over to her and began a conversation. The reason was that he had heard about Ruth before meeting her. The news of her arrival in Bethlehem was everywhere. And, of course, he knew Naomi. Boaz immediately took Ruth under his protection. Here's what he said to her. "Don't go and glean in another field, and don't go away from here. Stay here with the women who work for me. Watch the field where the men are harvesting and follow along after the women. I've told the men not to lay a hand on you. And whenever you are thirsty, go and get a drink from the water jars the men have filled." So apparently, during this time of the judges, a young widow might not be entirely safe, and I'm thinking particularly a Moabite woman. Then Boaz invited her to lunch. She ate with the harvesters, and Boaz gave her bread and roasted grain to eat. She kept enough to share with Naomi. Well, when Naomi learned that it was Boaz who protected Ruth that first day she was out in the field, she had her first glimmer of hope. She told Ruth, "That man is our close relative. He's one of our guardian redeemers." Guardian redeemers, kinsman redeemers, I think is what it says in the King James, are a group of close relatives responsible for getting family members out of difficulties. And this is the same word that describes God as a rescuer of Israel from Egyptian slavery and later on Babylonian exile. Of course, all of these acts anticipate what Christ, the Redeemer, does for us. Naomi has turned a corner. She begins to have a little bit of faith again. She says, God has not stopped showing his kindness to the living and the dead. Remember earlier she had said God had turned his hand against her. So Ruth continued to glean in the fields of Boaz during the barley harvest and then during the wheat harvest. It was now time to thresh and winnow the barley everyone had harvested. So, oh well, Ruth won't be running into Boaz in the fields any longer. This is where Naomi takes the initiative. It's her turn to help Ruth. Naomi told Ruth a bunch of weird things. She's like, wash up, put on perfume, wear your best clothes, and go to the threshing floor. Don't let Boaz know you're there, but after dark, after he has eaten, after he goes to sleep, go to him, uncover his feet, and lie down. That sounds so strange to us, doesn't it? That's the end of Naomi's instructions. She said, he will tell you what to do. Ruth, the very obedient daughter-in-law, says, I will do whatever you say. But she did a bit more than that. She followed Naomi's instructions, but when Boaz got cold feet, and woke up, Ruth proposed marriage. It may not sound like that to us, but that's what she did. When he asked, who is this? She said, I am your servant Ruth. Spread the corner of your garment over me, since you are a guardian redeemer of our family. Spread the corner of your garment over me? That means marry me and protect me. It's the same kind of marriage that Tamar needed when her first two husbands, Judah's sons, died before she got pregnant. I don't know if you remember this from 4 weeks ago. Tamar's solution, when Judah wouldn't give her to his third son, was to get pregnant by Judah himself. Well, this was not nearly quite so dramatic. Boaz agreed. He said, "This kindness is greater than that which you showed earlier. You have not run after the younger men, whether rich or poor. And now, my daughter, don't be afraid. I will do for you all you ask. All the people of my town know that you are a woman of noble character." So the kindness that Boaz refers to here isn't that Ruth preferred him to younger men. It was that she was still looking out for Naomi. She was wanting to marry a kinsman redeemer. And that meant Naomi's old property would be protected, and she'd have a lifetime of security. And all the people in the town know that Ruth is a woman of noble character. And this is very high praise indeed. There's just one catch. It wouldn't be a story if there weren't more catches, right? There's another kinsman redeemer more closely related to Mahlon, Ruth's first husband. Boaz promises Ruth that no matter what, she and Naomi will be provided her. And then he gave her about 15 pounds of barley to take home to Naomi. Well, Ruth snuck out of the threshing floor before dawn, before anybody could see that a woman had come to Boaz at night. And that's another reason why I think that this is Naomi's version of the story, that it's Naomi's story to tell. Would Ruth or Boaz have ever told people about this business? But only the three of them know what happened that night. Well, by this time in our story, we're all rooting for Ruth and Boaz, right? The one who's most interested, of course, is Naomi. I imagine her waking up all night wondering what in the world happened. And of course, the first thing she asked Ruth was, "How did it go?" as soon as she saw her. Well, Ruth explained, and Naomi knew that Boaz would not draw things out. She said, "He will not rest until the matter is settled today." And she was right. Boaz went to town that morning looking for the other relative and found him almost immediately. And along with that, the process took 10 other men, elders in the town, to be witnesses. Boaz explained that Naomi was selling this piece of land that belonged to her husband. Boaz asked the man if he wanted to redeem it. Oh no, the closer relative said he wanted to buy the property. Boaz then happened to mention that the relative would also acquire Ruth, the Moabite, and the rights to the property would go to any sons she might have. Well, that sounds very complicated to us, but that guy, he understood it immediately and said, "Oh, well, never mind then. I can't endanger my own estate." So he gave up his right to the property, and Boaz bought it all and acquired Ruth as his wife in front of all the witnesses. Now, Ruth wasn't even there, but he acquired her. The witnesses were delighted. They blessed Boaz, saying, "Through the offspring the Lord gives you by this young woman, may your family be like that of Perez, whom Tamar bore to Judah." I mentioned her before. And of course, Ruth did conceive, and she did bear a son. His name was Obed. He was the father of Jesse, who was the father of David, who became king of Israel. That's how Ruth, a Moabite, got to be part of the genealogy in Matthew that names 5 women among the ancestors of Jesus. And the story ends with Naomi. She took that child in her arms and cared for him. He was like her own son. And I'm sure Naomi was the one who told Obed this story of how his parents got together. It became part of the family tradition and was later written down and came to us in our Bible, our family story. And surprisingly, they all lived happily ever after. Ruth herself must have been surprised by the acceptance and the love that she received from Naomi's community. The women living in Bethlehem told Naomi, "Your daughter-in-law who loves you is better to you than 7 sons." And we know that Boaz was surprised by the loyalty Ruth demonstrated. He said that to her. And I imagine that Naomi was one of the most surprised of all by this incredible turn of fortune. It all happened because Ruth loved her and God had never turned his hand against her. So what can we learn from this beautiful story of loyalty and charity and love? One thing is that even in the time of Judges, there were faithful people who continued to live by God's rules. Boaz was a person like that. He remembered the laws about leaving gleanings for the poor. He was kind, he was honorable, he was generous. There's always a remnant who remain faithful and can be an example to foreigners like Ruth. Second, even if we get off the path, like Naomi, we can get back on. We can return home to the promised land. The trial we face may be difficult, but there is happiness to be found. And the third thing we can learn is that people like Ruth come from every nation, even the hated Moabites. When people are presented with a God like our God who cares about them and lives through his people, they can become part of God's family too. Anyone and everyone can be part of God's family. Amen.